Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. It's sort of a chilly morning. Today we're going to talk about a subject called creating the universe. And truth be told, I recorded this episode probably about 6 to 8 months ago, but the video screwed up. And so, no, actually, you know what? It worked just fine. But somehow I deleted the video or something, and during import didn't work right. So I lost it. I was pretty pissed off because I thought it was one of my better episodes. So when that happens, sometimes I go right back in and record, but if I can't, it takes me several months to kind of muster back up the need for something that was spontaneous at the time, you know. If you're a listener of the show, I just want you to know, I think everyone's pretty aware that this vacillates primarily between cerebral thoughts about who we are as people, and then there's the scientific stuff like the moon missions, aliens, dreams, that kind of stuff. And so I try to balance my approach on both sides. I am working on a Morgellons episode. I'm just doing a little more research update because I researched it a long time ago, but man, is the science way beyond where I last left it. So this episode is going to kind of fall between the two. It's going to fall between the cerebral and science. And let's face it, you know, when we talk about these kind of things in reality, it's usually either one or the other. We don't usually mix the two. And what's funny is a lot of movie plots are based on the mezzanine between the two, where a doctor has the wherewithal to think about the paranormal, right? This scientific analysis of cerebral thoughts. And I don't know why, as we as people, when we go to school and study things and talk to each other, we tend to bias ourselves or jump into the camp of one or the other. It's really strange to me, because obviously we live in both. Do you love anything in your life right now? Do you feel love? Well, then you know what one hemisphere is like. And do you think that you exist? Well, then you know what another hemisphere looks like. And so you kind of have proof, and that's just a crude example of each, but you can add a million examples to both buckets. And so we live in both hemispheres. But why create an episode called Creating the Universe? Is it just a gimmick? I would say there are no gimmicks at Deep Thoughts, to be honest. So I pull down this whiskey stick, which is amazing. Here's the thing. Let's rewind back to the let's you know, let me put it to you this way. When I teach class for kids, I always tell the kids why we're teaching the class. Because there's nothing worse in the world than having a teacher go up and start talking without explaining the benefits of why you need to learn this. That's why most of us didn't pay attention to social studies in school. What the fuck is social studies? I mean, we barely know the definition of the word social. I learned that, I think, in I think I was a sophomore in high school. And I learned social studies. I probably took it in junior high too. But think about it. Me as a mid-teenager, the word social. We have social media today in the 21st century. But in the 20th century, it was barely a term we ever used unless you became an adult. So why listen to this episode? It goes very simply like this. If I start talking about the universe in any way, shape, or form, be it dreams, rocket ships headed somewhere, the metaphysical mind, patience, that kind of stuff, or God, or the devil, aliens, all that stuff. The reason I mention all these is I'm painting a little picture in your brain. It always starts from the assumption that the universe is already here. We sort of always start our thoughts with, well, of course I'm here now, and where do I go from here? Now imagine opening a Swiss watch, one of those really immense Swiss watches with thousands of little gears and springs and whatever the hell they're made out of, and you show it to a caveman that is understanding some basic engineering principles like the wheel. Perhaps he's figured out the lever. So he kind of is not an idiot or anything, but you're showing him a Swiss watch. Hell, you could maybe even show it to someone who's built the pyramids. So look at this. You know that his ability to climb into the watch intellectually, mechanically, and reverse engineer what the hell he's looking at, it's going to be tough. So if you were the engineer assigned to teaching that person how the watch became what it is today, are you going to teach him backwards? Well, okay, this little cogwheel here, number 48, and all the 50 cogwheels that are in this watch, it does this, and then it shakes that, and we found out this, and we found out that. Are you going to go back to the very beginning of the conversation and say, okay, you see the sun? You see the moon? You notice how the sun comes up and the sun sets? You realize how we're warm in the day and everything is lit and safe, but at night it's cold and terrifying? Well, we wanted to know when these things were going to occur. And so we created this device to tell us when those cycles would occur. And all the stuff in here correlates with how the sun comes up, goes down, moon. You feel me, right? So what benefit do we have by trying to do that to ourselves with our reality, with this universe? I'm going to say a lot. We are now sitting inside of the Swiss watch. If any of you are Douglas Adams fans, as he said, you know, we're not supposed to be here with the B-arc, but we are the components of the world that is a computer called Earth, trying to find the question to the answer of life, the universe, and everything, right? And the sort of his book and that whole metaphor is so beautiful for this episode. So there's a big question. There's a huge question, and it's really not answered as well as I think some folks think it's answered. Atheists tend to believe a something from nothing model, and they may even argue that they don't support that because they believe that there was a singularity created from the previous universe, and this whole thing's been in a recycling boom and compression algorithm. A creationist believes that things like God were always here. And what's actually fascinating about that is that the common ground between the two hemispheres might actually be the same exact thing, which is that there is simply an is. The plural of an imaginary number, is, is. Well, Christian will believe, and many, most people that have a God will believe that their God has always existed. At times, various religions believe that their gods fall asleep and then wake up and then explode. But again, I think most of your Big Bang followers believe that the mass that created the singularity had existed in a previous universe, and it just keeps going in cycles, like Stephen Hawking eventually corrected his bad theory into. But we don't have to worry about exactly how it was created in order to begin the conversation, because we're going to pick an arbitrary point at the very beginning, and we're also going to pick an arbitrary point today. We're going to go from today closer to the beginning. Now, I've said many times on the show, philosophers are the engineers of reality. Philosophers are the Magellans of perception. What can we perceive, and what do we gain as a result of perceiving it? In many ways, mathematicians are sort of numeric philosophers, discovering math that has always existed, helping us understand things, creating techniques for calculus, creating, measuring the area under a curve. So we have to just stop for 1 second, and you can do this in your car, you can do this wherever you're watching this video, and let's just itemize a few basic components that we know exist in this universe. And let's not forget that we are human beings. We have 5 senses. And we are largely deaf to most of the energy in the universe. And we're mostly deaf to the frequencies of the universe, right? You don't really feel an X-ray unless the thing never turns off and, cooks a hole through you. But there's infinite power frequencies. There's infinite light frequencies, infinitely indivisible, infinitely small, infinitely large in frequency. And we're right in the middle of the whole thing. But what frequencies do we notice the most, right? Probably light. Our eyeballs do a pretty good job reconciling that. But before we go down into minutia, I think it's safe to say that we recognize energy and we recognize spirituality, emotion. Now, your Kurzweil followers, they're going to chalk everything up to a bunch of chemicals running around inside tubes, inside the skull cavity of a human being. And the problem with that is that there's tremendously brilliant creatures in this world that barely have any brain tissue at all. A giant squid has a brain about the size of your small pinky in one tube. It does not possess enough gray matter, according to the Kurzweil theory, to have a single thought capability, let alone the muscle memory to run 8 individual arms and legs with God knows how many little suction cups, with one big eye and a big, well, I guess 2 big eyes and a big beak, and know how to learn something from its predecessors. Squirt ink when it gets all freaked out. To digest food, wouldn't have enough brain power to digest food, wouldn't have enough individual instructions to tell its body how to grow, really. But it does. So I think most people that watch this show religiously, they understand that there's love, there's hate, there's happiness, there's sadness, there's indifference, there's empathy and sympathy. Yes, these things can be injured. If the human body gets injured, your vessel, your connection to your soul, based on this reality, you won't have all your faculties. Sure. And you can hit on the head and you become a monster. I've seen it happen. You could get hit on the head, become very docile. Now let's go back to energy for a second. What does energy really classify itself into? Well, there's fast-moving energy and slow-moving energy. The stuff that you can touch, pretty much the stuff that you can see, is slow-moving energy. And the fast-moving energy is pretty much what makes it possible to see it. A photon. Fast-moving energy is what powers your TV. The combination of a dielectric wave and a magnetic wave intersecting, creating an electromagnetic particle classified as an electron. That's what creates power. So we can see energy doing all kinds of different things, being things. Right? This camera is made out of energy. But it's using the other form of fast-moving energy to manipulate its inner guts. So those are a couple classifications of things in the universe. Amazingly diverse. On the, I would say, the spiritual side, think about all the gradations of emotions that we have. How many ways can you cry? To how many degrees to which you can cry? Think about it. You can cry in a way that your soul is barfing out of your mouth. And you can cry in a way that is just a little tear of absolute happiness that whatever's going on is going on right. Or you just watched a really funny video online. I've been watching this dude on Facebook. He calls himself the Bronze Cowboy. He's out of Scottsdale, Arizona. Holy hell. If you ever need any just good karma injected in your soul, I'm going to recommend this guy on my show. And you know I don't recommend anybody. I've been watching this guy. But after he's this bronze statue. And there's a bunch of hacks out there in the world that do this. But he's the most convincing bronze statue I've ever seen in my life. And people go up to him, sit by him, and he moves. And they, of course, scream. But the way they do it and the way he behaves, he's a mime. He won't talk or anything or break character, like most of them. And I live in, Hollywood area. And so I've seen a billion of these things on Hollywood Boulevard, and they're creepy. This guy's not creepy. But anyway, he'll juice up your soul a little bit with some fun karma moments. So on the energy side, we just have really 2 classifications. But think about, how many forms slow-moving mass can take. It's every object that you can see. Every blade of grass is that configuration of slow-moving energy. And think about how fast-moving energy plays with the universe. How many different batteries can you create? A 12-volt, a 9-volt, a 6-volt? So infinite configurations on that side too. Well, these are the building blocks that we have to understand prior to talking about the creation of the universe. I know it sounds maybe completely stupid to some of you, but if you really dial back and we're creating a blank container, either it's infinite container or it's a container, with some sort of boundary. We're putting this stuff in there. Or it was already there before we bought the container. But now we have this really interesting thing right in the center. We have what appears to be a soul. And talk about an enigma, people. A soul. What do we know about souls? Well, in this world, we don't talk about them that much. Younger people talk about soulmates. Older people who are idealistic continue talking about soulmates. Most spiritual people have no problem and think about their soul constantly. But what is a soul? How do we know that they exist? How do we interact with them? Are they really what we see? You're looking at me right now. If you're watching YouTube, you're hearing my voice. If you're going through podcast tools, here's what I think. And it's just a guy's opinion in the backyard. My soul is pushing through this body. And this body's configured in a certain way based on everybody who had sex before me within my family, right? They created me. They picked partners. They had conversations. One conception after another after another. At some point, you and I are related. But then there's this instance of me. And I think that the instance of me that you're listening to and have listened to is just an instance of me that is the combination of my soul being attached to this slow-moving energy and fast-moving energy. And that combination creates either a mature version of me or an immature version of me, an angry version, a happy version. It depends on my predisposition of genetics as to whether or not I'm an edgy person or a cool person. It relates to how I was taught the patterns of control or chaos, as to whether or not I lose, I lose my temper or I remain relaxed. It's actually amazingly gorgeous in terms of the variables that all participate in who we are as individuals. And you can think that that's a random occurrence in the universe, meaning the actual principles and programming that makes this combination beauty happen, or it was intentional. I happen to think that all the math that we discover in the universe is highly intentional. The universe runs every single day, whether or not I'm alive or dead, whether or not I ever existed or whether or not there's 10,000 of me on this planet. This universe has always existed and will always continue to exist regardless of my particular participation, right? And it's operating because it has the most flawless program that has ever been written. And programs, if nothing else, are just instructions, rules, possibilities, thresholds, highs and lows, infinite high, infinite low. And you and I live in it every single day. That should be mind-blowing on one level, just right there. For those of you searching for the Matrix, that is the Matrix. It's an intellectual matrix. No, you don't see green binary lines dropping out of the sky. But you don't need those green binary lines to see the exact same thing that that movie was portraying with on-point metaphor of green data flying up and down. What we have in front of us is all the mathematics that hold this universe together and make it tick. But what's interesting about it is the amount of dimensions of which that data exists, of which that information exists, of which those instructions govern, is seemingly infinite. And I don't know if you guys remember what exponential numbers are, but I would say 2 to the power of 2 is 2 times 2, right? You write the little supercase number to the right of the base number, and that's the exponential. So when things start multiplying times each other, they become an exponential themselves. 2 to the power of 10 is 2 times 2 times 2, all the way out till you multiply 2 times 2 10 times, right? Let's just, and I won't throw a lot of math at you, but think about this. All those little variables we've been discussing. And I think that you understand that we haven't discussed remotely all the categories. We've discussed some pretty big ones. We've discussed energy in its two forms that we know it to exist. Really, it's the same stuff, just moves in a different velocity and thus takes on different forms, becoming so fast that photons can't bounce off of it, therefore it becomes invisible. That's why you don't see air. And we seem to have this soul energy, our emotions, or at least emotions and all the spectrum of emotions are the result of having more than just energy governing us. Well, even though there's not a single human being alive that could conceive of infinite number sets, I mean, you can only conceive of the conception of the number sets, but you can't see all the numbers in your head at the same time. Considering that they're infinitely divisible and infinitely growing, both in the positive and negative, all dimensions of direction and space. You take all these variables that we've been talking about, and you can multiply them all against each other as exponential modifiers. Meaning you can take all the different shapes and sizes of energy, as we understand it, which is just electromagnetism, which has got to be the most primitive version of recognizable energy, and you can multiply it times every emotion. How many ways can you love someone? An infinite number of ways. You can love them in ways that do them harm, which we might say is the negative, and you can love them in a way that does them nothing but justice and benefits their souls, and that's the positive, right? Now again, we're still talking about the pieces and parts. We're getting primed for the juice of the conversation, which is putting this thing together. But how much can we not see? I feel like I exist. Don't you feel like you exist? Sure, my body's made of electrons, a bunch of other elements, but I also have all these emotions, tremendous amount of emotions. What's interesting about emotions, especially if you go with the Kurzweil electronic brain, with just chemical properties controlling the function of the brain, is that when someone is dying, you would imagine them to have very little interaction with their emotions. But what's very interesting is we've had plenty of people go to the edge of death and even cross over, and it would seem that the amount of energy I should pull back. The amount of experience and emotions that they're having at that last moment of life are sometimes incredibly profound, way beyond the amount of energy that their body has access to, right? Their coil, their body is running out of electrons. But they're having epiphanies of the most celestial kind. Steve Jobs' last words, I guess, were, "Oh God," like 3 times. People have had near-death experiences, run off and explore, astral project into the universe, see things that are in the rooms while they were completely unconscious. They never were conscious in rooms that they were operated on. When they leave and recover in ICU, they wake up and go, well, your pin was right there on the floor behind the door. They go in there and it's right there. No matter what, they would never have the view of the pin on the ground, but they know. This stuff has happened hundreds of times, people. Not just a couple ones that you saw in the 70s on a television show. No, it's happened hundreds of times. And right now there's a new group out there recording these things in HD, really getting into the background of people who have crossed over, validating their intelligence, validating their need for attention, or their lack of need for attention. And it's very impressive. And these people have taken a new tack because we're a little more mature now as a society. They're pretty much taking a tack of screw you. I saw what I saw, and I don't care if you believe me or not. I no longer fear death. And what's funny about that is you might have a scientist that tries to poo-poo their report, who I guess wants to fear death. It's really odd. I think I said I can't remember exactly what the episode was titled, but my most secular friends pass books between each other about the fear of death and how Freud had it all figured out. I guess Freud was not a spiritual person. Although dealing in the world of emotion, he was unable to recognize or acknowledge a soul. So is a soul made out of electrons? Definitely not. Because if it did, we'd see them float out of human bodies. We'd see them floating around if there were spirits talking to us. Nope, we've never seen and recorded, I shouldn't say seen, we've never recorded the electron cloud coming out of a human being and drifting into the ether as a result of passing away. which is why I've said in previous episodes, I believe that out of that infinite spectrum of energy that we cannot sense with our particular human bodies, that it could be one of two things. It's simply made out of energy that we don't have access to. It's too high frequency, perhaps it's too low frequency, whatever the case might be, we're simply unable to track it. And it does not affect mass the way we think it does. It is interesting that those that believe in Eastern religions have always worshipped the glandular system, right, the chakra system, as the touch points for soul energy to interact with the human body. And believe me, what utterly fascinates me is the Egyptians built temples where each chamber and each room matched the number of glands that the Hindus eventually ended up worshiping. And I think the Indians are actually potentially a spin-off of one of the dynastic periods within Egypt, because you have a very similar, like Nefertiti for me looks Indian, very Caucasian skull but darker skin. You could say Arab, but it's very interesting how there's this correlation between the two. Egypt was most likely raped and pillaged and destroyed for 40,000 years before we actually found it, and so you got to look at the hieroglyphs and just call a spade when you look at who is probably responsible for building the place, right? But what I want to focus on is that they had figured out, by not having another show in town, right, they listened to their bodies. They listened to the universe, and somehow they were able to identify that our glandular structure within our human body is painfully powerful, incredibly important. And it was the connection point between us and our true soul identity. Now, as I've said several times, the Egyptians seemed to have also figured out the left brain and right brain was sort of pre-allocated, whereby the right brain is a female trait of creativity and sensitivity, empathy and sympathy, and the left brain was more given to the, at least the genetic origination of man to hunt, kill, and be very myopic about those tasks. And yes, there's a couple cultures around the world where the women are the hunters and the men are the pampered, but those are pretty rare. And I would imagine that that was a flip at some point where perhaps the men convinced the women that that's the way it should be. You know, you think you should hunt. So there comes a question when you talk about souls eventually, where someone says, well, is the soul its own sovereign entity? Or is the soul a node, a neuron in an overall consciousness that we might call the universe? Okay, so if you think of a soul as being its own complete entity, then it has to have an ecosystem to feed itself that is its own way of hunting food, eating it, and excreting it, right? Something like that. And I'm imposing on a soul the ecosystem of our sort of life force, right? It may not have any such thing. But I think that when you start studying the relationship between a parent and a child, you will start to realize that there are connections. That the child could be hundreds of miles away, if not thousands of miles away, and if they become exposed to danger, the parent can feel it. Right? There's that famous situation where I think Elvis Presley was in a bad car accident and his mother called him. She had a really horrible feeling in the middle of the night and demanded to call her son. And, you know, back in those days there weren't cell phones, but she managed to get a call to him, and he said, well, you know, I was in a car wreck, but I'm fine. My very first car wreck in my life was a guy hitting me from behind, driving on a really dangerous highway in the middle of the night called the 118 here in California. And I was fine, but the guy flipped his car over on the top. Everybody was fine in the car, but it looked gruesome. It looked horrible. Gas just pouring out of this guy's car. I mean, just like the movies, man. It was horrible. Everybody was fine. Gas didn't light on fire. But I got home, and on my voicemail, approximately 45 minutes to an hour before I got home, right when the accident was occurring, my mother left a voicemail on my voice recorder wondering if I was okay. If I was as smart as I am now, I would have saved that tape. That would have been awesome, right? So there's a connection there. I think that when you fall in love with someone deeply, you invite a connection between the two of you. And it doesn't mean that you're going to stay together forever. But you will feel that you're connected no matter if you stay together or not. If you're the one that wishes you weren't connected, you might be annoyed by that, but I think it happens no matter what. Hindus believe, I think beautifully and maybe quite accurately, that if you make love to someone and orgasm with them, your souls exchange a connection forever. Either you, at that point, make a connection that will not be severed, or you take a part of their soul and put it in yours, I think is why the one way it's been explained. So your humble narrator believes that your souls are all connected. You and I are connected. I think if you watch this show, as a very simple example, if you watch this show and you feel like you and I are kindred souls because we think alike, not on everything, but overall, it's because maybe we're nearer each other in this big mesh of souls. We don't have to be physically close together. You could be in Germany. Doesn't matter. On the celestial scale of things, we're next door. I always thought it was brilliant, the family tree. What a great visual metaphor. You're really close to your relatives, for sure. Doesn't mean you love them all. Doesn't mean you talk to them all. But you do have a connection with them whether or not you like it or not. So if you believe that there's a neural net of souls and that we're connected, if you adopt the belief that I have personally, you might start to realize that you've created sort of a competitor with God. I don't think you actually have, but if you have that little brief moment and rejection of the theory because you don't want anything to compete with the thought of God, let me set your mind at ease. We are definitely individuals. That's our privilege in the world, in the universe. And our biggest gift from this higher source is to not have all the answers. That's the greatest gift we can have. Imagine if in the next second you knew everything about everything all at once, and you couldn't stop it. You couldn't create a void of no knowledge. You had it all. At that moment, other than our teeny brains exploding in this form, but let's say in a soul form, you're able to ingest that information, hang on to it. If you had all that information, the curiosities of the universe, which thrust us into exploration, is gone. There is no anger for God, and I doubt there's any love or happiness either. It takes limitations to feel those feelings. And we don't like to say that, right? We don't want to say that God doesn't have the ability to feel love. Why do we go to church? Well, to tell God that we appreciate Him, hope that He gets a kick out of it. I'm going to say that I dearly hope that God can feel something. It sounds blasphemous to suggest that He or she couldn't, right? But if you knew everything, where would there be a slight mystery to create a void where you wouldn't know everything? To know where every emotion of love is at any point in time and where it's always been, where it has ever been and where it will ever be. Perhaps there is no time for God. Perhaps time lives in, perhaps, obviously we think time is an illusion as human beings when you really get down to it. But to God, what would it be? All time would be a solid block of all things. So the greatest gift that God could give us would be not being Him. He's sitting there burdened out of his brain, right? Just living in complete sustainability. Making sure all these mathematical rules don't change all of a sudden. Because then we would unravel and cease to exist, right? Now, obviously, as a scientist, even if you're willing to buy the fact that we obviously have emotional spectrums and we have electrical spectrums and we have, or I should say, energy spectrums, and even if you're willing to say, well, maybe there is some form of energy that's undetectable that organizes in the universe and gains an identity, and that is what we might call a soul, keeping it all scientific, right? Perhaps the mathematical principles of the universe do not have a consciousness. They simply are. They are the mechanics of the universe, but they don't have consciousness. They simply are. They are what the is. So let's try to start reasoning, now that we have the basics, I mean, I've just absolutely touched the biggest pieces of the universe. But, if you want to take a moment to test the theory of those three categories of existence, you could say, well, I've got this emotion. Oh, that fits in that category. I've got a backpack over there that has my computer in it normally. I got this tripod. Well, that's energy argument he's talking about. Then I have my soul. Okay, well, that's that. Is there a fourth? The fourth is all the mathematics that holds the universe together, the fabric of the universe, the rules that govern the fabric, right? Of course, the obvious question, the Paul Harvey to this story is, who made it, all this stuff? It's easy to cop out and say, well, it just as it is. It's just always been there. I'm done. You wipe your hands clean, you walk away. Yeah, you could do that. But then you might get into another frame of mind, which is to say, well, we know this universe. This is our universe, and it's made out of these things. The laws and principles of mathematics and these three forms of existence, right? But what if there's an inconceivable fifth dimension, right? We can't conceive what's in that dimension, but that's where our Creator lives. He lives outside of all of this stuff. And within this container that you and I exist in, well, he laid down the operating system, which is all the mathematics that govern the universe. And then he inserted into that energy to start giving it a bedwork of what could become planets and stars and moons and humans and ants and blades of grass, etc. But that's pretty benign, right? That's pretty just stuff. It needs to have kind of a purpose, right? So perhaps the soul goes next. The soul comes in and starts to give it an identity. You start remembering things. You have reveries, reverences, as the West world would say. That's sort of, okay, you got some robots on your hands. I've given them a vessel. I've given them some identity. They're all beautifully living within the rules of the universe. That's kind of boring. Not much going on here. But I would imagine a creator would have an emotion about what he or she's doing. Well, I did this because I got bored. I did this because I love things to exist. I want to share my thing. I've invented this new thing. Love, hate, indifference, all these things. Maybe our creator feels this in the other dimension that we cannot perceive. And so he or she gives us a part of that spectrum or all of that spectrum, right? We don't know if we're feeling every emotion that can exist. Seems like we have a pretty good color wheel of emotion, right? With complementary emotions on the opposite sides of the wheels. If you're ever writing a book or a screenplay or something, you always go for the opposite of the emotion of the character you're working on to make sure you've got that pull in the story, right? So if someone's tremendously happy, it usually makes someone not so happy. But then you let this stuff live for a while. And let's just say the creator at first said, well, hey, something creates itself. I'm going to let it continue to exist. And as we've said several times on this show, it is my core belief that if you lived forever and learned everything, then you would become extremely unhappy and cease to have any purpose. Nothing would have any mystery. You would know where every nook and cranny of this universe was made out of. You would have lived on every planet, every moon. You would have been every place at one point, but you would have been yourself, right? Whatever your vessel is, that's what you are. But isn't it interesting? If you believe, and not all of you will, which there's going to be an interesting divide here. So if you're atheist, obviously there are no souls in your mind, and it's dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and dust to dust, right? You merely recycle like an aluminum can. And all those crazy emotions you had, well, you read a Kurzweil book, and it all made sense to you, right? Perhaps you watched surgeries on brains, and they opened up a brain, they poked all over it, and people were having memories and having odd feelings. You've seen people take drugs and they have suicidal tendencies, and maybe even they kill themselves, or they're super duper happy thinking, look, it's all chemicals. We proved it. The pharmaceutical industry has proven there is no soul. Instead of considering for 1 second that perhaps modifying the body merely is the aperture by which the soul has access to the body, and thus modifies the temporary state we call the mind. You buy a Play-Doh, factory when you're a kid. You got all these different colors of Play-Doh, and you got the star fitting and the circle and all these other different fittings, the spaghetti one. And, you push stuff through it, and it comes out, and there's no mystery. But if you got a soldering iron and you heated it up and you started melting away the plastic, which is the port of which the stuff goes through, and then you pump it through, and you've made a really bizarre shape. Maybe it's just goo or weird. All right, you're not going to be too surprised. You messed up the machine, and therefore you've messed up the beauty of what it was designed to do. It doesn't look like a 5-point star anymore. It looks like a bad cookie. So what's the difference? Your soul perhaps has a beautiful relationship with the body to orchestrate the chemicals in your mind. And as long as you don't toxify yourself and introduce artificial supplies of dopamine, of testosterone, of just toxic chemicals to break down the actual neurons in your brain, like aluminum that's found in vaccinations, thimerosal, mercury, all those pollutants in your body, diet soda, diet, sugars. Well, if you put that in your body, perhaps you're just getting the soldering iron out and poking yourself with it, screwing up your conduit to your body. Brushing with fluoride, destroying your pineal gland. You can't destroy the body and expect to have great communication with your soul. Trust me. But what happens, I'm going to take a little break. What happens when you don't do that? I'm going to tell you this. When you stop toxifying yourself, and you give yourself about 1.5 years with all of it, right? You'll become more intelligent than you've ever become in your life. Your memory will become more sharp and more three-dimensional and more timeline-oriented than you have ever experienced it in your life. And if you're already good at it before you detoxify, you haven't seen nothing yet, man. Now, there will be limitations. Well, I shouldn't say limitations. There will be limitations that you notice, let's put it that way, in others. Traffic will be slightly more difficult to tolerate. Having a conversation with your average fluoride brusher will be more difficult because you will be sentences ahead of their brain. And when you finally realize that the human mind was just detoxified, you'll realize that our base core genetics is still super powerful. Remember, I'm gonna remind you guys of this several times. The movie Casablanca was 176 pages long, at least in one of its iterations before it was produced. In Hollywood today, a page equals a minute of speech. So in that case, that movie would be over almost 3 hours long. But guess what? The movie was under 2 hours. It was like 96 minutes or something like that. How's that possible? Because in 1936, we didn't toxify ourselves like we do today, and we spoke faster, and the audience had no problem understanding the dialogue. And they had such success understanding the dialogue that it became one of the most popular movies in the world. And what's funny about it is, if you watch that movie and you're like, I don't get it, I don't know why it's so popular, it's black and white, blah, 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 you need to understand Casablanca is more brilliant than most of us ever realized before you go to film school. Once you study under Robert McKee, either reading his book or going to his class, you will come out of that class on the last day, having spent the entire last day analyzing Casablanca, and your jaw will be on the ground. It's brilliant. It's way more brilliant than you think. So I wanted to digress there so you could have a bit of an exercise for conversations you might find yourself in when it comes to the existence of a soul with someone who is convinced that there's just an atheist existence. And I I think that the only people that are happy to be atheists are people that have been raised in religions that were very abusive to them. And they're absolutely satiated and relieved to be outside of that paradigm of thought. Like I've mentioned George Carlin a lot. George Carlin was raised a Catholic. He hated the Catholic Church with a passion. He had nothing but bad experiences when he was in the Catholic Church. And so when he came out, he was putting his foot down saying, I'm an atheist because I can't stand the other place, which is the only other alternative he thought in his mind he had to accept any some sort of spirituality. Okay, I'm not part of Christianity either, right? But I believe in a soul. And I don't believe it out of any insecurities. I just think it makes scientific sense to me. Who knows what it is? But back to where I was going. Some of you heard this before in other episodes. But when we talk about the creation of the universe, it's just a small thing we have to cover. I think we recycle. But I don't think our soul recycles. You know we die. You know we're born. You know that there's at least some time between birth and death, regardless of how quick it happens. There's some time in there, right? Even a baby in the womb who passes away in the womb lived, right? If we mix these three components together, we have created life. Joyous life, right? But we still have created a problem, which is gaining all knowledge, never dying, remaining the same identity constantly. Identity as in body identity. You are right now a person with probably a first name and a last name at a minimum. You have specific parents, specific friends, relatives. You've had jobs. You've lived places. You have those memories. And hopefully I pray on to you that those are great experiences. But even the bad ones can be revered later on in life once you've overcome them, right? Overcoming anything that's ever happened to you that you disliked is your victory. It really is. So see it that way. It defines your strength. It proves to you you're capable. Not that you're weak. But I think that the reason why, once you put all this stuff together, you really just have some stuff, right? You have some life force. You have some emotional spectrum. Various forms of life from, again, you could be a bumblebee or a human being. Although bumblebees are now on the extinction list. They're trying to kill us off, right? But you and I know from observing, like we just said, we're born, we live, and we die. Well, why would that be the case? Why would that be the case? Why does a tree get to live 1,000 years and human beings only get to live maybe 100 if we're lucky? Well, you've seen a hummingbird, right? How fast they flap their wings, how fast their brains process flapping their wings, how they can do all kinds of stuff in a split second. And we're the lumbering, elephants to them. They always say dogs have dog ears because they measure the speed of the heart. Cats have cat ears. So there's sort of this relative economy of life. You sort of get a certain amount of life. A turtle can live 150 years, right? Maybe even 200 years. So I have all these hummingbirds flying around my head right now. They sound like little thudding helicopters. But it's almost as if a turtle gets the same amount of time on this planet, thought-wise, heartbeat-wise, as we do. And then we all pass away. Seems to be a natural cycle. Of course, with toxification of food, electricity, human beings are dying off a lot sooner than we should. And we know this for a fact, right? And if you've ever lost anyone to a sickness, it wasn't old age. You can see it. Anyone's had dementia or Alzheimer's in your family. You've seen it. MS or ALS. You've seen someone be robbed of their life before that was their time. But the need for reincarnation and the need for death, I should go probably the other way, but the need for death is the need for insanity to be stopped. If we knew everything, as Star Trek did a beautiful job with the Q Continuum character, I think that showed up in Voyager, who wanted to commit suicide because he learned everything about the universe. He was bored out of his mind. He wasn't dying, and so he kept learning and learning and learning. So the gift to us is that we die. The gift to us is that we die. Now, dying to us as human beings without the full understanding of the universe, without stopping for a second to think about what it means to live forever, it's a horrible thing. And it doesn't mean that we want anyone to die. We want people to live their full extension of life and then pass away at an old age after they have had the experience to experience everything they wanted to experience. Now, there are some brilliant people in this world that could probably live 1,000 years and still contribute more to society, right? But think about what it is to have Tesla not live to be 500 years old. A true brilliant person. The world would be a different place. We'd probably be a little bit further along than man would be capable of really understanding. It depends on how the world was managed after or during his lifetime, right? There seems to be this interesting cogwheel, going back to our Swiss watch. And the cogwheel for humanity is our life expectancy. We get thrust forward by these routine 1 in a million geniuses that come by every 100 years or so, and they advance as a cogwheel, right? Now, if we can fix the world's education, we should have literally billions of cogwheels on this planet, and we should be going at light speed towards peace and serenity, and start, discovering where the hell we are in the universe physically, right? So when I say I think we're reincarnated in order to prevent us from learning everything about the universe, and that death isn't what we think it is, I'm not by any means saying that losing someone in our life is a trivial experience, because it's a horrible experience. And you've got people that pass that are they're in their 90s or they're over 100, and you think, my God, they've lived an awesome life. It just depends. If you're viewing that from afar, it's easy to say that. But if it's your relative, your loved one, it depends on how much you know them. In my hometown, people lived over 100 when I was a kid. Tons of them. Almost everyone made it to their 90s or really upper 80s as like a low-end life expectancy. And everyone's house in Kansas has a fireplace, pretty much, if it was built before 1960, because central heating and central air didn't exist when these houses were built. And the interesting thing about a mantle over a fireplace was that every mantle looked like a scene out of Blade Runner, where you have all the old pictures of everyone. And I remember, I mentioned them a couple times, I can't remember their last name, but there was an old family, that a husband and wife couple that were friends of my parents when they were in their 20s. We used to go over there all the time, and they were in their 80s, and they were just the sweetest people on planet Earth. I think they gave me my first teddy bear, if I remember right. But on their mantle, I got to see the photographs of them when they first met. Long time ago. And you got to see that this old man, this old wrinkly old man, was the handsomest devil, and this woman was a knockout, right? So the two of them were like a super couple, and they made it all the way to the end of their life, right, together. And I believe they passed away beautifully. They didn't ingest all the toxins that we have today. They weren't surrounded by cell phone towers, so there wasn't any alternative for them besides wholesome food and getting all their veggies and stuff naturally, right? There weren't a bunch of vaccinations to kill them early, right? So when you see that kind of life, sure, you can go, wow, they win, right? They both lived a full life, and they lived it together. I can't remember if they had any kids or anything. But today we're riddled with our friends being diagnosed with things way too soon. I just want to say that because we need to detoxify to really understand what this episode's about, in my opinion. So you bring it all together, and you build in an ecosystem of life, a beginning, middle, and end, knowing very well that the soul is unaffected by any of this. So what does it mean to be reborn? What does it mean to be born? Let's think about it. Does your soul retain the information of what your body did? Good question, right? What evidence would we have that that occurs? Well, have you ever looked at a child in your lifetime and you go, wow, that kid has an old soul? I mean, they were just born, and they just have this maturity about them. You look in their eyes, which tell no lies, right? The doorway to the soul, as they say. And there's the answer right in front of your face. You're looking at a old soul inside of a child's body. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's because the parents are more mature. You know, it is a true fact that when you have children and you're older, your children are slightly more mature. They're less emotional. That is, if you're willing to parent. And if you've matured as a human being yourself. But I have seen plenty of children which I believe have ancient souls. And their parents do not. And I know their parents extremely well, right? So what's that say? It's not an upbringing thing. We as human beings can see that the age of a soul by looking in the eyes of a child. And you'll watch them interact with adults as they get older. And they have fluent conversations with adults before the age of 10. Sure, they're immature. They haven't had all the experiences of life, nor do they have the academic prowess of the adult. But there's something about their ability to conversate. One, they feel more comfortable in their skin. That's probably one of the first things you'll notice in a kid with an old soul. And we talk about it all the time. I think that's proof right in your face that it happens, that this ecosystem I'm talking about exists. And I think you could be a scientist and figure that out. Look at the kids that become childhood actors. They're always really mature. They can get on the Jay Leno show and have a conversation with Jay Leno. Again, they're cute because they're young. They say funny things, right? And if you watch the making of The Shining, filmed by Vivian Kubrick, his daughter, she interviews the little boy that played Danny. I forgot his real name, but he's this little tiny kid, you know, and they said, how much money do you think you made by making this movie? And he's like, he starts laughing, and he starts shrugging his shoulders. He's like, I don't know. He was probably like $500. And he's laughing because he doesn't know. But the kid captured a character that most adults couldn't capture, right? I think that speaks to the age of his soul. You know, people say that, I think it was in my God episode, I talked about, my gosh, his name escapes me, the British actor, Stephen Fry, is that his name? I think it's his name, Stephen Fry, who's a atheist, very proud of his atheism. Again, he was raised in a church of which he despised. But his big thing about God not existing was to say, I can see children suffer. And if God exists as the Bible says, which he probably doesn't, he wouldn't allow children to suffer. All right. Again, we're talking about putting this universe together. We are now the architects of putting this together. So we must put ourselves in the mind of a supreme being looking at supreme issues and supreme ecosystems, right? Well, what if death isn't death? And I've said this on other episodes, so I apologize if you see me repeat some of this, but this is in a different context. I'm asking you to be God for a split second in this episode. I probably should have said that at the very beginning. But if death isn't death, and you know it's not death, you know it's a healthy cycle of choice, of chance, of a fair universe where anything can happen. I think the system's pretty well protected, right? We don't have meteorites falling out of the sky killing us daily. We don't have space invasions from aliens that turn us into gold slaves, right? So we're pretty safe. Most of what we hate about the universe is, like I said in the last episode, pretty much what we've done to it. That's what we don't like. We've allowed the wrong people to run the planet. We accept concepts in our minds that are all bullshit. But let's say you're in this other ecosystem we've just painted, and you're born, and you die, and you die way sooner than you should. What happens in our system? Not exactly sure when, but at some point, we come back. Who knows if we go from human to insect? It seems illogical, right? It seems like perhaps we start a blade of grass and we grow up into a tree and then we become a single-celled being and then maybe we move up. Maybe we do adhere to an increasingly complex form of life. And then once you reach human, which is obviously the dominant species on this particular planet, this is it. This is the crown jewel. But when you become your very first human being, you understand that this is just the first one you're going to be in. And then perhaps, none of us like to think about this, but perhaps we live a bunch of lives as a male. The more left brain, mechanical, mathematical kind of person. And then we live a bunch of lives as females, and we become the caregivers to children. We live in pure empathy. We master that domain of all those emotions, but it takes us a while. And then perhaps we go back to center, doesn't matter what gender we are, and we become an equal left and right brain at some advanced point once we've had a chance to dabble in both. There's a bunch of mathematical rules that govern the universe, right? We agreed about that. You can see them every single day. Well, we tend to think that those rules only exist to govern energy. Fast-moving energy and slow-moving energy, mass and energy. What if there's a logic gate about being reborn? Where your soul goes after you pass away. Perhaps the tree of life is way more than just a metaphor. I know that all of you who've lived at least 20 years of life, you understand one explanation of life when it comes to people around you. You've met people in your life that you just met, and you could swear to God that you have known them your whole life. But you just met them. And they remain your best friends or very close friends for your entire life. And sometimes if you're really fortunate, that's your parent, that's your sibling, that's your offspring. And your offspring feels the same about it that you do, right? Sometimes it doesn't happen and don't freak out, right? But I honestly doubt that there are that many people on this planet that can't name at least one person in their life that at least they've known at one point that doesn't feel like that. So let's go back to, let's remember that thought. We're going to extend from that to this next theory. We talked about the tree of life, the branches that, they always say it doesn't fall too far from the tree. That's when you're like your parent or something, right? Or you're like your brother, or like your family in general, right? Well, if we are sewn into a fabric of souls, similar to the way the neurons in your brain are configured, but the only thing that happens when you're born is that neuron in its place, that soul in its place in the neural net of souls, it doesn't change positions in the universe. It simply adheres to a new body. And its relative in existence and consciousness within the waves of electricity goes through the souls. We think we're in the same room simply because our souls agree that we're in the same room. And you know what? We're about to recreate this metaphor. We've already recreated it, actually, in this world right now in the 21st century. It was actually created in the 70s, and then it rebirthed in the 90s, and it went away. But it's called virtual reality and exists right now. If you and I buy an Oculus or an HTC Vive, or somehow we get a netted cell phones together, or running the same app, and you're in the same room with me, and I put these goggles on, you see the same thing I'm seeing, and I see you and you see me, but you see my avatar, and I see your avatar. In this avatar, I'm a dragon. In that avatar, you're a unicorn. And I hang out with you and I talk with you, and for whatever reason, I can't take the headset off because I was born when the headset turned on. It just powered up, and I learned that I was a dragon. I look at my hands and I see dragon hands. And you look at your hands and their hoofs, and their unicorn hoofs, right? And we never get to get out of the goggles until we die. But the whole time, you and I are not necessarily in the same room together. If any of you have watched Black Mirror, you go to season 3, you watch San Juniper or something like that. It's the same exact thing in that episode. Two women meet, but they're not in the same place on planet Earth. They're on Earth, but they're not in the same place, and they find each other physically in the outside world towards the end. All right. Man has created that mechanism in this universe already, and we think that that can't happen in the universe? Taking that one step further and plagiarizing a previous episode of my own, we always say looking into the eyes is the window to the soul, right? There's something special about looking someone in the eyes. For those of you who missed the episode, here's a trick for you. Look someone in the eyes. Have a conversation with them. Then let them know we're going to do an experiment about the power of looking into each other's eyes. And then all you do is you put your hand just so you can't see the eyes. And keep talking. Keep trying to have an emotional experience with that person. It'll go away. And then remove your hand and feel the change. And then put it back. And then remove it and put it back until you feel the fact that looking into eyes is such an amazing experience. And why would that be? It's just more flesh of the vessel, right? In fact, you're seeing the majority of the vessel. You're just blocking a couple eyeballs. All right. Keep that in mind, right? Because that's what happens. We got these VR goggles. I got the dragon avatar. You got the unicorn avatar. But what if we made a little tricky little rule about our VR world? And that is that the eyes that we have in the real form always punch through whatever form we're in the avatar world. So my dragon has blue eyes. And your dragon has hazel eyes. Or sorry, your unicorn has hazel eyes. Because you have hazel eyes in whatever true form you're in. And I got blue eyes in the form that I'm in. But they get to punch through this virtual reality. They must be replicated as a rule. And so when we see eyes, we see our real selves. And somewhere in the back of our souls, in the back of our intelligence, we know this whole thing's a VR, but we've forgotten it's a VR. But when we look at eyes, well, it's the little trick. It's the little clue that was left behind. It's also a powerful device to bond us together. Those of you in love with someone, or if you've ever been in love with someone, you know that staring in their eyes is probably the most magical thing you can do. Even if you're in the middle of making love and you connect eyes, boom, it's like even better. And it's more spiritual, it's more deep. And that's usually where you bond with the person to the extent you remember them more if you happen to break up. Now, you don't have to be making love to someone. It could just be a loved one, right? The eyes are special. They also make us nervous sometimes, right? The reason why I think death is allowed is because it's an imperative of our existence. We, as the creators of the universe, I think you could prove mathematically, that you have to create death. And you don't want all your beings to disappear in the universe. You work really hard to make them, to allow them to exist, to perhaps procreate even, right? Who knows if there's a finite amount of souls or an infinite amount of souls? It depends on the size of the universe. It's really an argument we don't need to answer. We know we're here. You're here and I'm here and we're different people. Now, there are a couple theories. I guess one additional theory that's worth mentioning at this point, which is that there's only one of us. There's only one of us, and we are being all people at all times, restricted not by time. Now, in a larger sense, if we are a neural net of souls, let's just say, then that's sort of the same thing. We are the same being. It would be as if you had a plant with several, leaves or whatever. And if it starts dying at any place in the leaf, then the whole thing dies. And so we must treat each other as if we are equal because we are the same vessel. I mean, we're the same overall entity, which is why racism makes no sense. It's why hating your fellow man makes no sense. They are you and you are them. Now, whether or not you're sharing the exact same soul and transposing in places, well, that's just a semantic. It would cut down on the mathematics, right? You'd only have to have a singularity of a soul, and then the whole thing becomes really simple for the brain to conceive. I can conceive of one, can't conceive of infinity, but we know there's infinite number sets, infinite frequencies, infinite macro and micro. So, why wouldn't there be infinite souls? Regardless if there's finite stars, there's infinite numbers. Isn't that just mind-blowing, right? But there's definitely a difference between things that exist as we perceive them and things that are conceptual. A number set is conceptual. It is merely a tool to count. If there weren't infinite objects to count, we will never reach the end of infinity. No human has reached the end of infinity counting, right? No computers reach the end of infinity for counting. But if it doesn't need to count that high, well, then we just have a tool that always does the job. I think you feel me. What I really want to get you to do is to pull back from presumption, from starting in the state that you're in, and just accepting the fact that, oh, well, I'm going to have a conceptual thought about reality, and, well, of course there's humans, and of course there's the earth, and there's stars, and whatever. All right. It's okay if you do that, in my opinion, but let's say that the prerequisite for that class to think those thoughts is to have had these thoughts. To have had the thought of, well, geez, what would it be like if there was nothing in the universe and I had to create it? I was God. And then look out in the universe, see what you see. Take these classifications that I gave you. See if you can come up with a fourth one. I'd love to hear that in the comments, for instance. And see if this conversation doesn't simplify your entire approach towards everything conceptual when it comes to the category of what exists. Because I think you'll find it really simplifies things. It takes a little bit of sting out of death. If, let me button it up with this kind of thing. Let's say you're about to lose someone in this world. They're older or they're sick. And I could pull you aside. I could say, hey, I want to show you something. Come with me. And I get you inside of a vehicle of some sort. Looks kind of funky, looks kind of wild. And I say, I want you to meet somebody. And I take that vehicle and we zip zap, and there's like a Doctor Who thing that happens on the outside of the car, or whatever it is, phone booth. And we end up in heaven of some sort. Heaven being defined by the central consciousness is there to talk to, almost like a supercomputer. And I say, why don't you, before you experience this death that you're about to experience, which is, I guess, maybe a foregone conclusion, for whatever reason, you have as much time as you need in this room to talk to God about death. And you have a very simple rhetorical conversation with God, because he only talks to you in statements of which are rhetorical knowledge that you already had before you went into that room, because he gave you all the knowledge you need to answer all these questions. And you find out that perhaps we collectively created the universe. We made the decisions a long time ago before we created bodies. The maintaining all knowledge was a bad idea. The being reborn was the only way that we could survive in the universe and not freeze up, being infinite ourselves, right? And you start to learn that death is an imperative, but that it's not a final thought. It's not a final state of being. It's merely a transition back to the beginning where magic is real again, and you haven't been everywhere in the world. And maybe you have a little bit of an instinct because your soul did pick up on what you did, but it's still just an instinct. Maybe you feel like you should live on the coast because your last 10 trips figured out that you really like water. And some of you are like, I hate water. I love to be inland. Landlock me, baby. Some of you like big mountains with snow on them, and others like islands with volcanoes on them. But you get done with your conversation, however long that takes. You hear this argument, and it's not frightening anymore. You realize that you participated directly in the decision to make it this way. But you participated at a level that didn't have a body. You participated at a level that had a soul. And I bring you back, and I drop you back off in your life. And you know you have to face death. And you go back in that room where that person is. Hopefully it's an older person exiting through old age. And you take a look at him, and now with your newfound knowledge of the universe and your homogeneous integration in the universe, the fact that you participated in this, and you even know, even though the person laying in that bed passing away, they participated in this decision too. They agreed on this cycle, even though maybe now they don't have that knowledge. And then they pass. Doesn't mean you don't miss them. Doesn't mean you don't think back. Think, damn, we used to play cards together. Remember that? Used to go on vacation together. Hell, we used to just watch Johnny Carson together. or whatever. Used to make ice cream in the backyard. But this is the way it has to be. But you no longer fear at all your own death. You don't fear what happens to them. You know that it is a beautiful ecosystem that has been designed to be perfect and beautiful. And because perhaps you may have learned that the tree of life is actually very literal in its proximity of soul, hey, they might come back as your grandson. That's how I live my life. That's how I live. And believe me, I miss people when they die. Trust me. My God. You know, I cry for most of them. But I don't fear where they went. Yeah, and who knows what the cycle is exactly. In terms of, even if this is true, you maybe don't come back immediately. Maybe you chill out for a little while. Spend some time with the other tree branches that are the relatives that passed before you. You have a good time. You get to live some of those memories again in a different way. Maybe you rewind the VR program and you go back and play cards again with your relatives that are gone. Maybe you go to an Elvis concert because you always wanted to. Burden yourself once with trying to create the universe from scratch. That's the name of the game here. That's your homework. If you dig the series, please subscribe. If you like this episode, please thumb it up. I'm also on vid.me, just another place to get the videos. I'm also on iTunes, and we have the direct podcast at mkultraradio.com. If you go to deepthoughtsradio.com, you can click on it, go to that in your phone web browser, and then you can click on the RSS feed for the podcast, and it will launch whatever podcast reader you have on your telephone, and it will launch beautifully, and you can subscribe. I think that's about it. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.